here's a bunch of things you're doing right that are related to this that are important. Here's a small thing that maybe you could alter slightly and it would make me happy and maybe I'll return the favor at some point. And they think, oh well, oh maybe, maybe I'll do that, maybe. And then they practice doing it and you can give them a pat on the head and then you're both happy about that. That really works with people. It really works. So, okay, so what you see is that these high-level abstractions, let's call them ethical abstractions, are related to actions. They're related, and so you can see that relationship from the good person to doing something like tickle the baby properly. And then you can conceptualize it this way, that you have this massive overarching map, which is something like the story of your life, this, including its extension into the future, and then it consists of these subordinate maps, which can be broken down all the way down to the level of actions. And so then that explains to you to some degree how you can do the impossible job of calibrating your emotional response. Because roughly speaking, your emotional response should be proportionate to the level that's being assaulted by the anomaly, right? If it's way up here, you wrote your MCAT because you want to go to medical school, right? And so now the envelope comes and you're shaking away and you open it and it's like you got 25th percentile, just like a quarter of the people who take the test. Well, what does that mean? Well, this is sure all blown to hell, that's for sure. And so God only knows how many of these things are going to go too. Maybe your study habits really need to be, you know, you have to reconstitute yourself all the way down to the level of your habits. It can be devastating news. Now, one of the ways to protect yourself against something like that is like, don't have one plan, right? If you're going to stake yourself on something, you should throw a couple of alternative scaffolds up beside you so that you have somewhere to go. You want to be a doctor, okay? Well, you could be a nurse. It's like it's not a doctor, but it beats cutting your throat. You're still doing 80% of what you wanted to do. So you want to think about this during your whole life, man. If you're going to take a high risk, you want to scaffold yourself in other areas so that if it fails, the bottom doesn't drop out and you die. And it's also very much worth thinking about with regards to setting up your life in general. It's like, if you concentrate solely on your career, you can get a long way in your career. And I would say that that's a strategy that a minority of men preferentially do. That's all they do. They work like 70, 80 hours a week. They go flat out on their career. They're staking everything on the small probability of exceptional status in a narrow domain. But it's hard on them. They don't have a life. It's very difficult for them to have a family. They don't know how to take any leisure activity. Like, they get very one-dimensional. Now, it may be that unidimensionality is the price you have to pay to be exceptional at one thing, right? Because if you're going to be something like a genius level mathematician and you want to do that or a scientist, say, it's like you're in your lab all the time, you're working 70 hours a week or 80 hours a week, you're smart, you're dedicated, you're unidimensional, and that's how you get to beat all the other people who are doing that. It's the only way. But the problem is you don't get a life. Now, if you love being a scientist and you have that kind of focus of mind, well, first of all, you're a rare person, and second, you're going to pay for it. But fine, more power to you. But it's a risky business to do that. You sacrifice a lot for it. You know, and I would say most often, if you're speaking about having a healthy life, that isn't what you do. You spread yourself out more. So, you know, you have a family, you have some things that you do outside of work that are meaningful to you and useful. You have a network of friends. Well, those 3 things alone, or 4 things alone, are plenty to keep you well oriented. And then if one of those things collapses, you know, everything doesn't go. Now, the price you pay for that is the more you strive to optimize that balance, the less likely you are to be fantastically successful at any single one of them. But you might have a very, you know, if you consider your life as a whole, that might be a winning strategy. One of the things Carl Jung said, I really liked this. He thought that men went after perfection and women went after wholeness. So they're different value, they're different, there's something different at the top of the value hierarchy. So perfection would be stake it all on one thing and look for radical success. Not that all men do that, because they don't, but we're talking about extremes. at least with regards to the men that do that. The wholeness idea is more like, well, it's like I want one thing in my life to be 150%, or I want 5 things in my life to be 80%. Well, there's a lot more richness in a life where you have 5 things operating at 80%, but you're not operating at any of them at 150%. So, and I really believe this because I've watched men and women go through their careers now for a long period of time, and one of the things that, there's lots of things that produce this, but one of the things that I've noticed is that mostly women in their 30s bail out of unidimensional careers. They won't do them. They won't put in the 80 hours a week that they would have to put in order to dominate that particular area. And it isn't, the reason that they won't do it is because they decide it's not worth it. And no wonder, because why would that be worth it? You have to ask yourself that. It's like, well, you want to be an outstanding scientist. It's like, okay, really, that's what you want, because that means that's what you do. Because you're competing with other people, you know, they're smart, they're hardworking, and if you want to be at the top, you have to be smarter and work harder than any of them. And working hard means working long hours. I mean, it also means working diligently, but in the final analysis, it's also an additive issue. If I'm smart and hardworking and I can crank out for 70 hours a week, and you do it for 30, it's like, in 2 years, I'm so far ahead of you, you will never ever catch up. So, anyways. And I think partly, maybe part of the reason too that women are oriented that way more than men, I think there's 2 reasons. One is socioeconomic status does not make women more attractive on the mating market, but it does make men more attractive. And the second is women's time frame is compressed, right? Because guys can always say, well, I'll have kids later, and they can say that till they're like 80. Whereas women, it's like, no way, man, you got to get it together by the time you're, let's say 40, but really probably by 35, but definitely by 40, because otherwise it ain't happening. And that's bloody dreadful. Like, the most unhappy people you ever see, no. No. One of the common routes to extreme unhappiness is to want children and not have them. I wouldn't recommend that. You know, you see couples who are in their 30s. 1 couple in 3 over the age of 30 has fertility problems. That's defined as inability to conceive after 1 year of trying. 1 in 3. So it's worth thinking about, because people are very, very unhappy if they want to have kids and then they can't. Man, you're in the medical mill for 10 years if that's what happens to you. So, okay, so anyways, back to this. I think what I'll do, what time is it? Because I'd have to open up a whole new can of worms, so to speak, to do the next part. So I think actually what I'm going to do is just recap what we did and then stop. Or maybe we can have some questions, or maybe we can call it an early day. Okay, so what is the fundamental issue here? What did we discuss today? All right, so you're in a frame, and we've laid out its characteristics. It has a goal in it, it has a current position in it, it has rules for operating within it. It governs your perceptions, which is a really critical thing to understand. And while governing your perceptions, it tells you what's useful to you and what gets in your way, but most importantly, it tells you what you don't have to pay attention to. So as long as your damn frame is functional, you can ignore most of the world. And that means your stress level is way lower than it would normally be. Okay, so perception, motivation, all of that's integrated into those frames. And then the emotional element comes out in that when you're within a frame, things that move you forward and validate the frame are positive, and things that get in your way and invalidate the frame are negative. And then the next issue is, well, if your frame is invalidated, exactly what does that mean? And you can't answer that without thinking about the hierarchy of frames, because if you're lucky, it just means your frame needs a minor alteration. That would be equivalent to Piagetian assimilation in some sense, right? You can stay in the frame, you just make a small adjustment. I think the Piagetian distinction between assimilation and accommodation is technically inaccurate because it's a continuum, right? I mean, if I want to grab your pen, I have a little frame that will enable me to do that. You say, well, I'm staying within the frame to move that out of the way, but actually I'm not. What I'm doing is I'm doing a small micro revolution in the frame, moving that to pick that up. And so I think accommodation, there's no hard distinction between assimilation and accommodation. It's a continuum. So you'd say, well, if the top end of your map gets blown out, that requires accommodation. And if it's just a little micro change at the bottom, that's assimilation. But there's no real difference between this except for scale. And there's kind of a continual scale, not an absolute dichotomy. So, okay, so anyways, back to the emotion. Something happens and it isn't what you wanted. What does that mean? Well, it could mean anything. What you do is you start trying to micro adjust the frame at the highest level of resolution, but then you might find that you can't do that, so you have to jump up to the next one. You have to jump up to the next one. You have to jump up to the next one. And each time you do that, the psychophysiological cost increases. So okay, so we talked about the cost end of the spectrum, and then we also talked about the engagement end of the spectrum. And so the idea would be, well, if you're very much engaged, say in, let's go to that again. If you find it very engaging to play with your baby, then you might be doing it in a way that's indicating that you're taking good care of your family, that you're being a good parent, and that you're being a good person all simultaneously. And there's rich meaning in that, and the systems that orient you with regards to meaning are saying, look, you're doing this microaction in a way that benefits the maintenance and maybe even the expansion of all the frames that exist above it. And that's exactly what you want. You want to be doing that all the time if you can. And so that implies that you want to delineate out a pretty well-developed value system so that you're not acting at odds with yourself. And you also want to have that integrated within the broader society so that society isn't existing towards you as a continual obstacle and making your life miserable. So, okay. Good. Questions? Any of that not make sense, or do you have any objections to it? It's funny, I mentioned the word matter, you know, because things are made out of matter, or maybe they're made out of what matters, but the word object is the same thing. You could say that the world is made out of objects, or you could say that the world is made out of what objects. And both of those, weirdly enough, they're equally true in some sense. Question?
So you said the main circuitry for the part that's with the positive affect is the dopaminergic system.
Yes.
And are you assuming that when you reach point B, it will be the opioid system?
No, it's the serotonin system in all likelihood. So serotonin seems, so the question was positive emotions mediated by dopamine when you're advancing towards something, say, or when you have a cue that something good is about to happen. What is the system that mediates positive emotion at the satiation level?
And if I can add the negative affect one
Yep.
as well, what is the circuit for that?
Yep, okay. Well, let's start with the satiation issue. That seems mostly regulated by serotonin. The opiate issue is, there are other forms of specific reward that don't seem to be merely motivated or merely underpinned by dopamine. And the opiate system would be one of those. There's an oxytocin system as well. So there are other biochemical systems that are involved in more specific forms of reward. But the thing that's common among instances that make it appear that you're moving forward is the dopaminergic element, roughly speaking. And then one of the things that happens if you're higher in serotonin because you're more dominant is that you're more satiated all the time. That's why people who are low in the dominance hierarchy with decreased levels of serotonin are more impulsive and also more emotionally dysregulated. They're more impulsive because, hey, you take your positive thing when you can get it. And so they're more dissatisfied. They're more looking for anything that will produce a positive outcome. And then they're also more likely to experience diffuse negative emotion, partly because their serotonin systems are lower, indicating their tenuous status in the dominance hierarchy, meaning that everything they do that's uncertain is far more dangerous.